Nebraska Territory, October 1866. Anki Brandt was building her house for a second time, but she was building it from the inside out. To the handful of other settlers scratching a life from the unforgiving soil, it looked like madness. She was making her small cabin smaller still. Day after day, they saw her hauling buckets of water from the creek, her shoulders stooped. They saw her mixing clay, sand, and straw with her bare feet, the thick mud squelching up past her ankles. This wasn't for chinking the gaps between the logs. That was done. This was something else, something alien. First, she had nailed thin wooden laths, little more than scrap, vertically against the interior log walls. They were spaced evenly, meticulously, creating a hollow space about the width of a man's hand between the cold outer logs and whatever she was planning next. Then came the mud. She packed the thick, heavy mixture of clay and straw against the laths, building a smooth, solid wall. It was a slow, arduous process. Section by section, this new, damp skin grew, consuming the precious interior space of her one-room cabin. The men at the trading post chuckled into their beards. Elias Thorne, the man who had built nearly every structure in their small community, shook his head with a sigh of professional pity. He had seen foolish things on the prairie, but this was a special category of folly. They gave it a name, a mocking, dismissive name whispered at first, then spoken openly. They called it Ank's clay coffin. They said the German widow had lost her mind to grief and loneliness. What did this quiet woman, with clay under her fingernails and a memory of a different world in her eyes, understand about survival that these hardened, experienced plainsmen had so completely missed? The answer was coming, carried on the back of a wind that had not yet begun to blow. If you believe in the power of forgotten wisdom, hit that subscribe button and join us for more stories of quiet genius. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from as we uncover the secrets of the clay coffin. The problem in Nebraska was not the land. The land was generous in the summer, offering deep black soil that could swallow a plowshare. The problem was the sky. In winter, the sky became a vast, empty vessel of cold, and the wind was its voice. The wind was a physical presence. It was an architect of misery, finding every hairline crack in the cottonwood logs, every pinhole in the mud chinking. It carried a cold so profound, it felt less like a temperature and more like an absence of life. It didn't just chill a person. It seemed to leach the very heat from their bones. The standard cabin was a testament to brute force and plentiful timber. Walls were thick logs, laboriously hewn and notched. The gaps were stuffed with whatever came to hand: dried moss, grass, mud, even old rags. At one end stood the heart of the home, a massive stone fireplace, wide enough to roast a deer. It was a design born of necessity and tradition. It was also a catastrophic failure of physics. The fireplace was a monster, a glutton for fuel. A family's winter was measured in cords of wood. The men spent the autumn felling, splitting, and stacking, creating small mountains of fuel that would dwindle with terrifying speed once the first snows fell. The fire itself was a liar. It offered a blazing, cheerful performance of warmth, but it was a localized spectacle. Stand directly before its hearth, and your face would feel scorched while your back remained cold. The heat it produced was almost entirely convective. Hot air, light and inefficient, rushed up the massive chimney and was lost to the prairie. The chimney, a column of stone, acted as a siphon, constantly pulling the precious warm air out of the cabin while simultaneously drawing in drafts of Arctic air from a dozen unseen cracks. For the settlers, life in winter was a slow retreat. It was a shrinking of their world into a small circle of light and heat around the fire. Water barrels left against the far wall would freeze solid. Ink in its well turned to a black slush. At night, families would sleep huddled together under a mound of every blanket and pelt they owned, their breath crystallizing in the air above them, a rime of frost forming on the wool. Waking up was the hardest part. The fire, banked for the night, would be little more than a pile of cold ash. The cabin's temperature would be nearly identical to the air outside. It was a daily battle to reclaim a small pocket of survivable warmth from the overwhelming cold. Anke Brandt knew this world. She had survived one such winter, her first without her husband, Klaus. She had felt the icy tendrils of fear as her woodpile shrank faster than she could have imagined. She had watched her two small children, Lars and Sophia, their faces pinched and blue with cold, and she had sworn she would not endure another winter like that. She would not leave her family's survival to the mercy of a roaring, wasteful fire. Anke was not an engineer. She was not a scholar, but she was the daughter of a master craftsman. Back in the old world, in the rolling hills of Bavaria, her father had not built houses. He had built hearts for houses. He was a Kachelofenbauer, a builder of masonry stoves. She had grown up not with the open, roaring hearth of the American frontier, but with the quiet, radiant warmth of the Kachelofen. These were colossal structures of tile and brick, often occupying the center of a home. A small, hot fire was burned in them for only an hour or two in the morning. The genius of the design was not in the fire itself, but in what happened to its heat. Instead of a straight chimney, the hot gases from the fire were routed through a labyrinth of serpentine channels within the stove's massive body. The brick and tile, a dense thermal mass, would absorb the intense heat from the smoke. By the time the exhaust finally left the chimney, it was cool to the touch. All its energy had been captured. For the rest of the day and all through the night, the great stove would release that stored energy, not as hot, dry air, but as gentle, pervasive, radiant heat. It warmed the objects in the room, the walls, the furniture, the people themselves. It was a deep, penetrating warmth that felt like summer sun. Anke looked at the American fireplace and saw not a source of heat, but a machine for wasting it. She saw the frantic, constant feeding of logs as a fool's errand. She understood that the secret to staying warm was not to make more heat, but to keep the heat you already had. Her past gave her a perspective her neighbors simply did not possess. They were fighting the cold. She intended to store the warmth. The construction began in earnest as the last of the summer heat faded. The first step was the most counterintuitive. Anke spent days sawing and splitting scrap lumber into thin laths. With methodical precision, she nailed these strips vertically onto the interior of the cabin's log walls, from floor to ceiling. Each lath was roughly 3 inches deep, creating a uniform, hollow cavity. Elias Thorne had stopped by on his way back from the trading post, his curiosity overriding his skepticism. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man whose hands, calloused and capable, had shaped this settlement. He had raised barns, built homes, and even fashioned the church's steeple. He understood wood, stone, and the prairie's brutal logic. What he saw in Anki's cabin defied that logic. "Frau Brandt," he began, his tone gentle, trying to mask his concern. "What is the purpose of this gap? You're building a space for the cold to hide." Anka did not stop her work. She looked up from the bucket of clay at her feet. "The cold does not hide, Mr. Thorne. It moves. I am giving it nowhere to go." He shook his head. "It will be a channel for drafts. Any heat you make will be stolen by that hollow space and pulled right into the logs. You need insulation, tightly packed sod, more chinking, not empty air." His argument was sound, based on a lifetime of experience. An air gap seemed like the opposite of what was needed. She simply nodded. "I must try my father's way." Next came the great mixing. She created a shallow pit outside her cabin door, and into it went clay. She had dug from the creek bed, sharp sand, and bundles of straw from her meager harvest. She poured in water and began the grueling work of treading it, her skirts hitched up, walking in circles for hours until the mixture was a perfect plastic consistency. Her children, at first hesitant, eventually joined in, their laughter a strange counterpoint to the serious, heavy work. She carried the mixture inside, bucket by heavy bucket. She had created a temporary backing of rough-sawn planks behind the laths. Against this, she began to build her wall. It was not like laying bricks. It was a sculptural process, packing the wet, fibrous clay firmly, building it up in thick layers, or lifts. Each lift had to partially dry before the next could be added, to prevent slumping. The cabin grew dark and damp. A thick, earthy smell filled the air. This was Thorne's second objection. He returned a week later, ostensibly to bring her a share of a deer he had shot, but truly to check on her progress. The interior wall was halfway up. Condensation beaded on the window panes. "Anke, this is not healthy," he said, his voice firm with authority. "This much wet earth inside a sealed cabin, it will never fully cure before the first freeze. It will sweat all winter. The damp will get into your lungs. It will grow mold. You are building a sick room for your children." Again, the logic was undeniable. Everyone knew dampness was a killer, the partner of consumption and fever. To deliberately introduce so much moisture into a home on the eve of winter was tantamount to suicide. "It will dry," she replied, her voice calm, her focus on packing another handful of the clay mixture into place. "The fire will dry it." Her final modification was the most audacious. She turned her attention to the great stone fireplace. She did not dismantle it. Instead, she began to build around and behind it, using flat field stones she and her children had collected, mortared together with a stickier, richer clay mix. She narrowed the firebox opening, making it smaller, deeper. Behind it, she constructed a complex, winding channel, a horizontal serpentine flue that snaked back and forth for nearly 10 feet within the mass of her new interior wall before finally venting into the base of the original chimney. When Thorne saw this, he dispensed with all gentleness. His face was grim. "Stop this, now," he commanded. "I have built 30 fireplaces in this territory. You are restricting the flue. You are creating back pressure. The first decent fire you build in this thing will not draw. It will pour smoke back into the room. You will suffocate in your sleep. You are building a tomb, Anke." His words were not meant to be cruel. They were a desperate warning from the community's foremost expert. He was describing a scenario every builder knew and feared. A poorly drawing chimney was a death sentence. The community's mockery solidified. The clay coffin was no longer a joke. It was starting to sound like a prophecy. Women from the settlement would visit, bringing pies and bread, but their eyes would dart nervously around the strange, damp, shrinking cabin. They would plead with her to stop, to let the men help her chink the logs properly, the right way. Anka simply worked. She finished the wall, smoothing its surface with a wet hand until it was seamless. It was 8 inches thick, a solid monolithic shell of earth wrapped around the inside of her home. With the construction complete, a new kind of quiet fell over her work. The system was now whole. Its principles were simple, yet revolutionary for this place and time. It was an engine designed to capture and radiate energy. When she lit a fire, the hot smoke and gases would no longer rush unimpeded up a wide chimney. They would be forced to navigate the long, winding path of the stone and clay flue she had built. As the superheated gases crawled through this labyrinth, the dense mass of the surrounding clay and stone would act like a sponge, absorbing the ferocious heat. The smoke that eventually exited the chimney was no longer a pillar of wasted energy, but a cool, lazy wisp. The fire itself was small, hot, and brief. She used only a fraction of the wood her neighbors did. But for hours afterward, the 8-inch thick clay wall, the enormous thermal battery she had built, would slowly, gently radiate that stored heat back into the room. The 3-inch air gap, Thorne's channel for drafts, was the final piece of genius. It was a thermal break. The radiant heat from the warm inner wall could not easily conduct across that gap to the freezing outer logs. The inner cocoon of warmth was decoupled from the outer shell of cold. Her cabin was no longer a single-walled shelter fighting the outside temperature. It was a house within a house. Anka Brandt hadn't built a coffin. She had built a lung that would breathe warmth all winter long. Then December came. It arrived not with a gentle flurry of snow, but with an Arctic hammer blow. The settlers called it a blue norther. The sky to the northwest turned a bruised slate gray, an ominous wall of cloud that swallowed the horizon. The temperature, which had been a tolerable 20 degrees Fahrenheit at noon, began to fall. By sunset, it was 0. The wind picked up, a low moan that grew into a high, vicious scream. It carried snow not in flakes, but in fine, horizontal needles of ice that scoured the landscape and stung any exposed skin. By midnight, the thermometer at the trading post read 15 below. The old trappers, men who had spent decades on the plains, exchanged worried glances. This was no ordinary storm. This was a generational cold, the kind of weather that rewrote maps and erased memories. Inside the conventional log cabins, the battle for survival began. The wind, a malevolent, intelligent force, found its way in. It hissed through the chinking, whistled around the door frames, and poured down the massive chimneys, driving smoke back into the rooms. The great fireplaces, once symbols of comfort, became insatiable maws. Men worked in shifts, bundling themselves in every layer they owned to make the terrifyingly short journey to the woodpile and back. The logs, frozen solid, burned with a desperate, rapid intensity, their heat snatched away and hurled up the chimney as fast as it was generated. In Elias Thorne's cabin, the one he had built for his own family with extra care, the situation was dire. Despite a fire that roared so fiercely the stones of the hearth were too hot to touch, the far corners of the room were sinking into a deep freeze. His wife, Mary, had hung blankets over the door and window, but they did little to stop the penetrating cold. The water in the bucket by the door was a solid block of ice. A loaf of bread on the table was frozen hard as a rock. Thorn could see his breath, a thick white plume, even when standing only 10 feet from the fire. He was a master builder, the most respected man in his trade for 100 miles, and his expertise was worthless. His craft, his knowledge, his entire system of belief was failing before his eyes. He stuffed rags into the gaps around the window frame, his fingers clumsy and numb. He watched his wife trying to soothe their crying son, wrapping him in another pelt. The boy's shivering was relentless. Thorn felt a cold deeper than the wind's chill. It was the cold of helplessness. And then he thought of Ankie Brandt. He pictured her in that small cabin, the one with the foolish mud walls and the half-choked fireplace. He imagined her and her 2 small children alone, with no man to chop wood through the night. He had warned her. He had practically begged her to stop. Now, the consequences of her stubbornness were surely unfolding. A knot of guilt tightened in his stomach. He had mocked her, stood by while the community ridiculed her. What if his final warning had been a prophecy? What if the smoke had filled the room? What if their fire had gone out, and they were now huddled in a damp, frozen tomb of her own making? The thought was unbearable. He had a duty. He was the community's leader, in his own way. He could not sit by his own failing fire while a widow and her children froze to death because of a foolish foreign idea. He turned to his wife. "I have to go check on the widow Brandt." Mary's eyes widened in disbelief. "Elias, you can't. You won't make it 100 yards in this. It's death out there." "I have to," he said, his voice resolute. He pulled on his heaviest coat, his thickest mittens, and wrapped a wool scarf around his face until only his eyes were visible. The journey was not long, perhaps a quarter of a mile. In the blinding, shrieking blizzard, it might as well have been to the moon. The moment he opened his own cabin door, the storm assaulted him. The wind tore the breath from his lungs and tried to rip the door from his hand. The air was so cold it felt like inhaling shards of glass. He leaned into the gale, his world reduced to a maelstrom of white. He could not see more than 5 feet in front of him. He navigated by memory, by the feel of the frozen ground beneath his boots. Each step was a monumental effort. The wind pushed, clawed, and screamed at him. Ice crystals formed instantly on his eyelashes, blurring his vision. His legs grew heavy, his face numb. He began to doubt his decision, to fear for his own life. But the image of Ankie's children, small and helpless, pushed him forward. After what felt like an eternity, a faint, dark shape loomed out of the white chaos. Her cabin. There was no light visible from the single window, which was shuttered. A plume of smoke, impossibly thin and lazy, rose from the chimney, refusing to be scattered by the gale. It was the first strange detail. It should have been whipping violently away. He stumbled to the door, his heart pounding with a mixture of dread and exertion. He raised a numb, mittened hand and banged on the thick wood. He expected a long delay, A faint, weak reply, or worst of all, silence. Instead, the latch clicked almost immediately. The door swung inward. It was not the sight that hit him first. It was the feeling. A wave of warmth, dense and absolute, washed over him. It was not the scorching, dry heat of a fireplace, but a gentle, enveloping warmth that seemed to emanate from the very air. It melted the ice on his eyelashes and thawed the frozen scarf around his face in an instant. He staggered inside, pulling the door shut against the raging storm, and blinked, his eyes adjusting to the soft lamplight. The scene before him was one of impossible, profound normalcy. Anke Brandt stood before him, wearing a simple wool dress, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. She was kneading dough on a small wooden table. In the corner, her two children, Lars and Sophia, were on the floor, playing with carved wooden animals. They were barefoot, on a night when the mercury in his own thermometer had frozen and sunk to the bottom of the glass. Thorne's mind struggled to process the sensory data. The air was warm and still, with the pleasant smell of baking bread and wood smoke. There was no dampness. There was no draft. He looked at the walls, the smooth, pale clay walls he had mocked. He reached out a hand and pressed his palm against the one on the north side of the cabin, the one taking the full, brutal force of the blizzard. It was not hot. It was not cold. It was deeply, radiantly warm, like a sun-baked stone in late afternoon. He tore his eyes from the wall and looked to the fireplace. He had predicted it would spew smoke, that it would fail to draw. Instead, it was burning with a quiet efficiency he had never witnessed. A few small logs rested on a bed of glowing coals, giving off an intense heat with almost no visible smoke. He looked at the wood box next to the hearth. It was nearly full. His own wood box, at that very moment, was half empty, and he had been feeding his fire like a madman since sunset. The full weight of his ignorance, of his arrogant certainty, crashed down upon him. He had not been witnessing folly. He had been witnessing genius. If you believe this moment of revelation is worth it, do us a favor and hit that like button. The proof Anke offered wasn't just in the feeling of warmth. It was in the numbers, and they were about to change everything on the prairie. "Frau Brandt," he stammered, his voice hoarse as he unwrapped the scarf from his face. "How?" Anke simply gestured to a small, brass-cased thermometer hanging from a nail on the wall. Thorne stepped closer, his boots dripping melted snow onto the clean-swept floor. He squinted at the delicate red line. It read 68 degrees, 68. It was a comfortable spring day inside this cabin while a hurricane of ice tried to tear it apart from the outside. "And outside?" he asked, though he already knew the answer was beyond measure. "I do not know," Anke said calmly, never stopping her kneading. "The thermometer I keep on the porch, the mercury is frozen. It broke the glass this afternoon." Frozen mercury. That meant the temperature was at least 40 degrees below zero, a 108-degree difference between the inside of this cabin and the outside. The number was so staggering it felt like a physical blow. Nothing in his experience could account for it. "The wood," he said, pointing a trembling finger at the wood box. "How much have you burned since the storm began?" "I made a fire this morning, for about 2 hours," she said. "A small one again before supper, to cook the stew. The walls do the work now. They are full of heat. The walls do the work." The phrase echoed in his mind. He had built houses his entire life based on the idea that the fire does the work. He had been wrong, terribly, fundamentally, professionally wrong. He had been building shelters. Anke Brandt had built a reservoir. He walked the small space, a student in a classroom he hadn't known existed. He ran his hand over the clay wall again, feeling the steady, constant radiation of stored energy. He saw how the smaller firebox concentrated the heat, how the massive flue system must be soaking up every last calorie of warmth before releasing the smoke. He finally understood the air gap. It wasn't trapping cold, it was protecting the warmth, isolating this inner sanctum from the brutal reality of the logs just inches away. He looked at the barefoot children playing happily on the floor. He thought of his own son, huddled and shivering under a pile of furs. Anke's system wasn't just a curiosity, it was the difference between thriving and surviving. It was the difference between life and death. Elias Thorne, the proudest and most competent builder on this stretch of the prairie, turned to face the German widow. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a profound and humbling awe. His voice was thick with an emotion he rarely showed. "I was wrong, Frau Brandt," he said, the words tasting strange in his mouth. "Everything I said to you, everything I thought, it was all wrong." He took a step closer. "When this storm passes," he said, his voice dropping to an urgent plea, "you must teach me. You must teach me how this is done." When the great blizzard finally broke 3 days later, it left behind a world of pristine, deadly beauty. The sun shone on a landscape buried in feet of snow, the air so cold and still it hurt to breathe. The settlers emerged from their cabins like survivors from a shipwreck, blinking in the bright light. The cost of the storm was immense. Nearly half the livestock had frozen to death in their pens. Several families had cases of severe frostbite. Everyone had burned through a terrifying amount of firewood, and winter was far from over. But a story began to circulate, a story that defied the shared experience of misery. It started with Elias Thorne. He told the men at the trading post about the barefoot children. He described the wave of warmth that had met him at Anke Brandt's door. He spoke of the full wood box and the 68-degree temperature. At first, they didn't believe him. They thought the cold had gotten to him. But Thorne was not a man given to exaggeration. His word was as solid as the foundations he laid. He took 2 of the other settlement elders to see for themselves. They entered Anke's cabin and were met with the same irrefutable proof. The warm, still air, the comfortable children, the radiant walls. The evidence of their senses was undeniable. The clay coffin had been the warmest, safest place in the entire territory. That spring, a revolution began. Led by a humbled and zealous Elias Thorne, the men of the settlement did not just build new cabins, they retrofitted the old ones. Anke Brandt became their teacher. With quiet patience, she showed them how to mix the clay to the right consistency. She drew diagrams in the dirt with a stick, explaining the serpentine flue, the importance of the air gap, the physics of thermal mass. They worked all summer. Cabin after cabin was transformed. The men would erect the laths, and the women and children would mix and apply the heavy clay. Thorne, using his builder's eye, helped them refine the process, finding better stones for the flues, improving the mortar. He gave the method a proper name, one spoken with respect: the Brandt Inner Wall. The following winter was the test. When the cold returned, the settlement was ready. The change was miraculous. The frantic, all-consuming work of feeding the fireplaces vanished. A small morning fire kept the cabins comfortable all day and through the night. Fuel consumption across the settlement dropped by more than 60%. But the true impact wasn't measured in cords of wood. It was measured in human lives. The infant who had been born during the blizzard survived his first winter, sleeping soundly in a warm room. The elderly woman who had nearly died of pneumonia the previous year sat by her window, sewing, no longer confined to her hearth. Families could use their entire homes, not just a small circle of warmth. Children played, and life went on, even when the wind howled outside. Anke Brandt never sought praise or payment. Her reward was the safety of her children and the quiet satisfaction of seeing her father's knowledge take root in this new, harsh land. She had faced down mockery and isolation, armed only with a principle her neighbors couldn't see. She had proven that tradition is only valuable until a better way presents itself. The story of Anke Brandt and her warm cabin is a powerful reminder that sometimes the most profound innovations come not from new technologies, but from ancient, forgotten wisdom. It demonstrates that the most arrogant expert is the one who is unwilling to be proven wrong, and that true progress often begins with one person quietly challenging the accepted way of doing things. The principles of the Brandt inner wall are far from obsolete. The core concepts of thermal mass, radiant heat, and a thermal break are foundational to modern, high-efficiency building science, seen today in passive solar design, masonry heaters, and super-insulated homes. The Quiet Widow from Bavaria was simply a century ahead of her time. If this story of frontier ingenuity inspired you, hit that like button to help us share it, and subscribe for more tales of forgotten history and practical wisdom. We have to ask, what's the coldest winter you've ever had to face? Let us know in the comments below. The story you have just heard is a fictionalized account, inspired by historical building techniques such as the Kachelofen and Adobe thermal mass construction. The characters, names, and specific events were created for dramatic and educational purposes. This content is for entertainment and should not be considered professional engineering or construction advice.